Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome back to the Muslim Matters podcast, where we discuss everything under the sun that affects Muslims, such as faith, local and global politics, social media, sex education, civil rights, and family matters, all coming from a traditional Orthodox perspective. Subscribe to our podcast and follow us online on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram on our handle, Muslim Matters, and check out our site daily at muslimmatters.org.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to the Muslim Matters podcast. I am your host, Zainab bint Yunus. Today's episode is meant to tackle yet another trending set of buzzwords, but more importantly, to delve more deeply into our own spiritual tradition and to separate the fluff from the meaningful. Decoloniality is a nifty word that's been making the rounds, especially in discussions about Muslim countries, resistance against oppression, and revolutions. To help us examine this topic more substantially, we're joined by our guest, Muhammad Saad Yacoob. Saad Yacoob is a student of knowledge, an aspiring writer, and a poet. Saad has a bachelor's in English from George Mason University and is a PhD student in Arabic and Islamic Studies at Georgetown University. Jazakallah khair, welcome for joining us at the podcast, Saad.
Hey, assalamu alaikum. Thank you for having me.
So yeah, this is a really trendy topic right now. Decoloniality is becoming a really popular term bandied amongst certain academically and social justice inclined groups, but now it's making its way from the ivory towers to the masses. And unfortunately, when we're having these discussions about decoloniality, a lot of it is usually couched in secular framework with some Muslimic trappings, as I like to call it. And so before we get started going deep into the deep dive, could you give us a brief summary of what quote unquote decoloniality seems to mean in most circles?
So there's kind of two parts to the question, right? The first is the question of what the actual theories are of like decoloniality, post-coloniality, etc. And then the second is how does that get filtered down and come into the public sphere, right? In general, you can imagine major philosophical ideas within the academy or within the philosophical circles taking about 20 to 30 years to filter down into the larger imagination and then influencing thought that's happening there. I think one of the best examples for that is existentialism, which started in the 1930s going up to the 1950s, 60s with Sartre. And then after Sartre's really major works, it takes about 20 years for that to filter down into the greater society. And then everybody starts thinking about meaning in life through an existential lens. The same thing happens with queer theory. And then the same thing happens with postcolonialism and decoloniality. So I think right now what we're seeing is that trickle down effect from the academy and from intellectual circles, from philosophical circles into the more everyday common. And especially since there have been a significant amount of trigger points over the last, let's say, 5-10 years that have significantly increased the interest in, because realistically, like the way the system works is it makes itself invisible and you only see it when there is a flashpoint and you see the kind of the heavy hand of imperial powers keeping everybody else down. Until then, they're very good at making things invisible. And so in this moment, like starting really with the Arab Spring and then BLM and things like that, you saw the way that the system perpetuates its hierarchies. And through that, there was a lot of interest that kind of grew, and then that really began or sped up the trickle down effect of these theories into more lay circles, if you will. Then there's a second part of the question, and that question is, what is decoloniality itself? And I think it's important to separate decoloniality from two other very distinct but interconnected ideas. The first is anti-colonialism. The second is post-colonialism. The third is decolonialism or decoloniality. And a lot is said by the name, but there's also more to it than the name. And I'm gonna make a point here, and I'm gonna put a pin on it, and I'm gonna come to it all the way back to it when I talk about decolonization. That point is that anti-colonialism is the most distinct from post-colonialism and decolonialism. Decolonization. And the reason why that is because the other two are coming out of a tradition that is now known as critical theory. And critical theory is the idea where you marry moral imperatives. You can have philosophy which is morally ambiguous, but the idea is to take moral imperatives and to marry them with a whole host of different, to marry it to analysis that comes from a wide amalgam of knowledges. and traditions. So, for example, if you look at somebody like Beatrice Spivak, who is a really prolific writer in the post-colonial tradition, when you read her writings, it is like your mind is blown by the amount of knowledge that she has. And that knowledge is coming from the Western philosophical tradition. It's coming from anthropology. It's coming from poetry and literature. It's coming from all sorts of different areas. And she asks like single questions or multifaceted, but single questions, and then pulls together all that knowledge to create a theory. And then that theory has to have an answer that is a moral answer to it. Her biggest article that she's written is Can the Subaltern Speak? And the central question was right in the name: can people who are not represented in history actually be represented in history? And then she pulls all sorts of knowledge from all sorts of traditions and answers the question that, really realistically someone's going to have to do the speaking for them, and it ain't them. And what ends up then happening is you have to have a moral imperative that comes with it. That's really what makes critical theory critical, right? That's what differentiates it from something like anthropology or sociology or even kind of pie in the sky philosophy. The question isn't just pulling out the theory and showing how things work. It's then, how do we take what worked, the way things work that are immoral, and then make it more moral? And so there's this element of moral philosophy and this element of this moral imperative that's tied with critical theory, and that greatly affects postcolonialism and decolonization. Anti-colonialism as a phenomenon, I wouldn't say an intellectual tradition, as a phenomenon in the world, is not necessarily as tied to that strict moral imperative. And this isn't to say that anti-colonialism is not moral, or that anti-colonial thinkers didn't think that what they were doing was moral. It's that anti-colonialism can often be somewhat morally ambiguous, in the sense that you have anti-colonial movements where the anti-colonial actors are committing serious atrocities and they consider themselves to be justified. And you have anti-colonial movements in which there isn't a shared moral language which exists with post-colonialism and decolonization, which I'm going to put a pin in that. I'm going to come back to it when I explain the other two. Anti-colonialism in our tradition would be something like the Algerian War of Independence. Major figures like anti-colonial movements could even be, right? You could even see Ataturk as an anti-colonial actor, but he's distinctly not a post-colonial actor, and we're going to get to that distinction later. And the reason why, like, what brings them all together, what makes them anti-colonial, is the fact that there is a colonial power. That colonial power has come in and has done the colonization, and there are these actors who are using their power and their influence and their connections in society to rally people together. And there's a movement that is it's usually both a lay and an elite movement that is acting against the colonial forces. That's anti-colonialism. It's fairly straightforward. The other two are intellectual traditions. And those intellectual traditions are greatly affected by you can see them as offshoots of the larger tradition of critical theory, which itself is an offshoot, but more like affected, like a parallel thing that's very deeply affected by the Marxist tradition. And that's what separates the two of them. Does that make sense?
Yes, that definitely clarifies it a lot more. I think just because of the nature of these discussions, as you said, brewing in academia for 20 or 30 years before they get to us, there's still a lot of background that the layperson would just be like, all right, I don't even get this. And I'll be real with you. I'm one of those lay people. So I get the gist of it, which is what we really wanted to have made clarified. So you did that. Thank you for that. And now moving on to, as you said, anti-colonialism being the actual physical lived practice of removing the colonial powers. Well, connected to that is the reality that almost every Muslim country has experienced some kind of Western or secular colonization in its past, or it was formed and impacted by Western colonial powers. So what would you say is an apt description of how the Ummah as a whole has been impacted by colonization? And I know that's a huge question. Maybe just keeping it connected again to this main theme of moving to discussing what decoloniality will mean for us. But given that we have been colonized, unfortunately, in such a way that was, I'd argue, historically unprecedented, and that just has impacted our psychology, our cultures, our politics in so many ways. What would you just say again as a brief summary of the ways that we've been impacted by colonization?
Oh man, when you sent me this question, I just sat there for a few minutes looking at it, being like, where do I start?
Yep.
Right. But and it's not just like in ways that we've been impacted, but it's also timeline, right? If I was to give like somebody was like, we'll give you unlimited amount of time to talk, which would be a terrible mistake, and they said just go for it, I would start in 2000 BC with the invention of the composite bow by East Central Asian tribes. Uh, really, I'm not a hard determinist when it comes to history, where like this leads to this, and there can be no other way. But I definitely believe that there are certain environmental, geographical, cultural factors that kind of move things in a particular direction that require serious human agency to alter. And it's actually really hard to very succinctly explain why the Muslim world was impacted so heavily by by not just by colonization, but also by colonial thought. And what's embedded within this question, and within the question that almost everybody asks, is the understanding that you have two distinct traditions. One is the Muslim tradition, and one is the European tradition. And realistically, up until about 1500, there are distinctions between the two traditions, but they're not really that distinct. If you go to a Muslim random Muslim land in let's say 1490, right? Like right before 1492. And you listen to people talk about worldviews and the way society is structured and the way that the common experiences with people in power and hierarchies and things like that, you might be actually very surprised as to how similar people describe the way the world works in somewhere Istanbul, which was
Hmm.
Constantinople at the time, which, by the way, interestingly, Constantinople was the name for Istanbul internationally, even in the Muslim world, until the 1900s. So if you read travel accounts from when Maulana Shibli Nomani travels from India to Istanbul, he calls it Qustantiniya. Uh,
Right.
so, anyways, that's a random tangent. So if you talk to somebody who's randomly in Istanbul or is in like Baghdad, and you talk to them about their worldview, and then you go like to Paris or to Vienna or to Madrid, like the major cities of the Western world, and you ask them the same questions, you'd be very surprised as to how similarly they view the world, but they just have kind of distinctions in religious, theological distinctions that are important, but are still interconnected with each other.
Hmm. And would you
All of
argue
that
that's because at that time most of Europe was vaguely Christian at the very least, more so than it is now. And of course, Islam and Christianity do share, and Judaism do share a common historical spiritual origin.
would argue it has to do with gunpowder.
Interesting.
So the most important invention since probably fire of probably in the last 2,000 years to 3,000 years, the most important invention that has had the most societal impact and has started a series of events that completely changed the way that people imagine themselves in the world was gunpowder. And the reason why that is this is why I started the question. I was like, oh, how far do I go back? Do I want to go? But now I'm like excited about this topic, so I'm just going to ramble. The reality is that gunpowder isn't a recent invention. Like the Chinese have known about it like forever, but gunpowder was brought westward by the Mongols. And the major thing that you have to like conceptualize in order to understand the effect of gunpowder is that there existed more or less two major divisions of military strategy in the world. One was very cavalry heavy, one was very infantry heavy. And the infantry heavy traditions have been more towards the west, and the cavalry heavy tradition has been more towards the east, with the exception of China, which was very infantry heavy before the Mongols. And then after the Mongols, it became very cavalry heavy as well. And a lot of that has just to do with terrain, right? In the west is very mountainous, particularly places like Austria, Hungary, Greece, all very Spain, very mountainous places. And so the kind of up and down constant the topography of the land basically makes it very difficult to have horse-based armies, because horse-based armies are all about momentum. So when gunpowder is invented in China, it doesn't really take off as a medium of warfare, but it goes west with the Mongols and it gets to Europe. And the Europeans at that time are, you can think about you've watched Lord of the Rings, right? Lots of knights in armors and
Oh, yes.
banging each other on the head with maces, right? That's like the typical depiction of a medieval European battle. And it's not too far off. It's not too far off. What ends up happening is they realize that this weapon, guns, has the ability to pierce armor. And this is like the holy grail of Western warfare. Because Eastern warfare is highly mobile. It's on these horses. You're constantly running around shooting each other with arrows. And you don't have tight infantry formations that make inaccurate weapon fire doable, because you need to be more accurate. With Western warfare, you have these very tight, compact formations. And so if you can shoot randomly, because they're very inaccurate and they took forever to reload, but if you could shoot randomly into a bunch of knights that were wearing armor and you could pierce that armor, this is basically the holy grail of weapons. Whoever's better at it wins. And so this starts like an arms race in Western Europe about how to perfect and improve the efficiency of these gunpowder weapons. And that starts from Mongol invasions in like the 1200s, and it really, really reaches its zenith it reaches its serious maturity in the 1500s, to the point where it's completely revolutionized society. And the really important thing to understand with this is that societies are very, very closely linked to social structures, and hierarchies are very closely linked to how people have to organize for war. As long as cavalry and knights and things like that were very important, and lots of armor, you needed a class of people that was trained from birth to be able to fight like that, because it required intense training to be able to do that. And the average skill, of the kind of basic rule of thumb, is one trained and armored knight with just a sword was basically undefeatable by hundreds of peasants,
Right.
as long as you could take them like 3, 4, 5 at a time. And all that changed with a gun. The Indiana Jones scene, right, where the guy's like swimming the scimitar and Jones pulls out the pistol and shoots him.
So that pretty much epitomizes what you're referring to.
Exactly. Imagine your entire society is based on the idea that you need these people in giant tin cans to be able to bash people side the head with maces and swords. And all of a sudden, some random peasant can come up and shoot them.
Yep. And there goes years and years of training and equipment and everything else.
Exactly, right? And then what they realize very quickly as well is the most important thing is to have really tight groups of these peasants all shooting at once. There's no way you're going to get the nobility to stand in very tightly packed groups walking into musket fire. You're just not going to be able to do that. And even if you did, what's the point, right? You can have a peasant do the same thing. Why not do it? And so that completely revolutionizes, let's say, 3 or 4 aspects of society, for the sake of simplicity. The first is just organization of how you get military conscripts, right? You've gone away from these elite knight armies and have gone to these masses of peasants armed with muskets. It completely, now that you're in this arms race, right? Sword manufacturing was difficult, blacksmithing was difficult, and it required a lot of expertise, but the kind of mathematical calculations that were necessary for gunpowder, and especially the holy grail of all gunpowder, which is cannons, that was a completely different world. And the kind of engineering that was necessary to not just make these weapons, but to make them safe, to make them efficient, and to make them easily deployable. That level of engineering was completely different than anything that came before. And then you had the question of how are you going to supply these things? Like like armies went from 10,000, 15,000 in the 100 Years' War between France and Britain to like hundreds of thousands in the 30 Years' War. And that's just because you could equip them a lot easier. But now you're in like this arms race in equipping. So logistics, that had a completely revolutionizing effect in logistics. And then that had to have a revolutionizing effect in economy, because now you had to be able to actually provide for these massive gunpowder armies. As gunpowder, and then this trajectory of development takes place over hundreds of years, right? So it starts in 1280, and by the time the 30 Years' War starts in 1618, you've had about 350 years or so of these continuous slow developments that are happening, that are having philosophical, social, communal, hierarchical, economic, all sorts of effects. And these effects that are happening because of the way that war is being fought now are not happening in the East. And the reason why they're not happening, people like calling the Ottoman Empire and the Safavid Empire and the Mughal Empire the gunpowder empires. But the reality is that in 1618, so the 30 Years' War obviously is one of the most important wars in the history of the world. And in the 30 Years' War, the Austrians, the Habsburgs basically would fight in these tercios. And they were basically like, they consisted of something like 60,000 infantry and maybe 8 to 10,000 cavalry. That's a huge difference from Ottoman armies, where infantry would be like 30,000, cavalry would be like 70,000. And it was completely flipped. And the Ottomans didn't see a need to change because their horses were still just so much better at what they were doing than European horses. And so it gave them completely different capabilities. I'm not going to go into military history. It's actually relevant, but it's not the point here. But the point is that kind of shift that needed to happen in order for modernity to develop over hundreds of years in Europe was not happening in the Ottoman Empire because they were more efficient with their horse armies. And it wasn't until the late 1700s, late 1700s with Sultan, I think it was Sultan Selim, the like 45th or something. Each one has, so there's 9 murads. It's crazy. But like Sultan Selim has this attempt to modernize armies, particularly because of cannons and the way cannons function. But by then, what he realizes is that he has to do, and the Ottoman emperors in general realize this after him, that he has to do in decades reorganization of society that was done over centuries in Europe. Because
that was a matter of playing catch up.
Exactly, right? And the reality is that what happened in Europe over those few hundred years, they were just much more efficient in their war making, in their economy, and in their political organization and logistics than anything that could be put together in the East. And so when they finally overtook Eastern modes of warfare, they continued to overtake. Whereas Eastern modes of warfare kind of reached their zenith in the 1600s, and that's where they remained. So you had basically armies from like the 1900s fighting armies from the 1600s, and there's just no comparison of how that's going to go. And when they start to colonize, what Muslims and just colonial peoples in general realize very quickly is that the technological modes of that they are thinking is, okay, so when they arrive and they blow everything up and kill everybody and take everything over, everybody's like, oh my God, we need to stop these guys. And they very quickly realize you can't stop them. And they're like, okay, why can't you stop them? Oh, because they have guns and their guns are really good. Okay, they have guns. We can get guns. Muslims had guns, but the technology was significantly worse. They're like, okay, we have guns. We can do something about it. Then very quickly they realize that they can't compete with the technology and they can't compete with the logistics. Okay, then how do we try to make this technology better? And then they realize that they don't have the know-how to make it better. But the guns aren't even the issue. The issue is all of Western society is arranged in such a way that makes these armies mass producible and efficient, but also that makes technological advancement continuous. And so the sultans in the Ottoman Empire, as well as the emperors or the petty kings in India and the Safavids as well, they're like, okay, so we basically have to completely reorganize society and rearrange the way people think in order to catch up with these guys. And we have to do that in a couple of decades before they run us over. That is the real problem.
Okay, that is a fascinating approach, that it really not just boiled down to, but it was, as you say, gunpowder itself, which forced this change in Europe that gave them a massive advantage over the Muslim world due to a number of different factors. And then Muslims realizing a little too late what that meant for our communal empires.
And one of the things that it really eliminates, like we're really big in I'm sitting here in America, and we're all like America, freedom, liberty, meritocracy. These are American concepts, and we contrast that with kind of feudal hierarchical mindsets, right, where you have lords and vassals and whatnot. The other, but a lot of that has to do with the fact that you don't need those. In fact, those lord and vassal relationships are counterproductive in empires that are gunpowder based and trade based and manufacturing based, whereas in the kind of feudal empires of, I use feudal here very loosely, but still feudal empires in that were still functioning around the world, those are still very important ways of thinking. Now imagine going to your nobility, be like, guys, I love y'all, but y'all gonna have to go.
There's no use for you anymore.
Exactly. There's no use for you anymore. Like you can get shot, and that means that you're expendable. So like you take too much money and political privilege to maintain, you're gonna go. You're just gonna have to go. Can you imagine the amount of chaos that creates in society? The kind of it's not just political and social reorganization. It's reorganizing the way people even imagine who they are. As a peasant or a petty soldier in the Ottoman army doesn't just imagine himself as a soldier of the Ottoman Empire, right? But this, by the way, also pet peeve, because I know you love literature. Every fantasy novel has the knight get up and say, "For the Empire." This is not the way they thought. This is not the way they thought at all. Like for them, it was their liege lord and God. Those were the two things they thought about. In movies and books, it makes a lot worse line if you go, "For my vassal, for my overlord, because I have to pay him taxes."
It's not as romantic anymore.
And it's not as romantic at all. But you can imagine that person who thinks of himself as like his core identity is that he is subservient to a overlord who is subservient to an overlord who is subservient to the padishah, right? If that is the way you look at the world, and all of a sudden you're removing all of those intermediaries in between, that is completely reimagining the way that people think of themselves.
And that in turn takes up the entire structure of all society.
Exactly, right? And it doesn't just doesn't influence on things like political organization. It also has influence on law and the Sharia itself. There's a lot of things in Sharia where it has, for example, certain ideas of what obedience means. But those ideas of obedience only make sense in a world that is structured in a hierarchical arrangement of obedience and responsibility.
Yes. And we see the consequences of the changed Western approach in terms of how, just at a family level, how Muslims in the West in particular, but I'm sure that this applies even in the East as well, the way that we view ourselves as parents, for example. Like we have a lot more discussions in the West, I would argue, about, do I really need to obey my parents in XYZ? That would have been absolutely unfathomable in the past.
Of course, because in that like, you're obedient to your parents, but your parents are obedient to their overlords, and their overlords are obedient to somebody else, and they're obedient to somebody else, and everybody's obedient to the king, and the king is obedient to God, right? Like this is the way that the system is supposed to function. Did it ever function like that? No, that's the way it's supposed to function. To question the idea of obedience, because when people ask, am I really supposed to be obedient to my parents? You ask them, well, what's wrong with it? And they should be like, they're like, I'm my own person. I do my own thing. I have my own life or whatnot. The other, what they're actually questioning is not obedience to parents. It's obedience.
Full stop.
Full stop, right? How does that question even make sense in a society where the entire thing is structured around the concept of obedience?
Exactly, yeah. It's a really fascinating bit that you brought out there, because it doesn't just stop at familial structure or the wider societal structure. It goes to the heart of spiritual structure itself, I would argue. And obviously for us as Muslims, Tawheed is ultimately our belief in Allah and our submission to Him, our obedience to Him. And thus, I would argue, just as we have questions of, do I really have to obey my parents in this context? The next jump forward from there, which again is already very widespread, is, why do I have to be obedient to God?
Theology is the idea that the conceptions of God have a significant effect on the conception of of politics and political authority.
Mhm.
But Dr. Shirley Tareen, he has a book called Contesting or Defending Muhammad in Modernity. And it's about the Bundy and Braley polemic. And one of the things he does is he inverses that. And he says that there's also a massive effect on the political authority and organization on how people imagine their relationship with God. That is really important, but it has obvious manifestation of that actually is not so much people contesting obedience, but more contesting intermediaries between them and God. And so you see this throughout, as starting from the 1750s onwards, right? You see this massive movements, revolts almost against tasawwuf, against anything that people feel is like, these movements feel is a intermediary between them and God, and an emphasis on that direct relationship between man and God. And this is actually a really interesting parallel between the way the state system used to function prior to modernity and after modernity. In prior to modernity, you have all these vassalage systems, right? You have
Right.
the peasant to the lord, to the duke, to the and all the way up to the king, and then the king to God. And so you have these intermediaries that are built in between you and the highest levels of state authority. Whereas if we look at ourselves in the modern world, that's not really how it functions. You don't have any intermediaries between us and the president where we go and we'll submit a petition to them. And by the way, they see still function like this a little bit, right? So they'll go to their immediate boss and they'll be like, boss, you are the most powerful person in the company. You are the one who has given us all of our good. I need a raise, right? That's like the very typical way of imagining that relationship, because then that boss is going to go to his boss and say, boss, you are the most important in this company. And then he's going to go to his boss and say, exactly. It's like brown nosing all the way up. But that's not really how we imagine any kind of structure of anything in the modern world. Like, we consider that actually to be disgraceful and disrespectful to yourself. But that's literally the way people imagine their social structures. And that's also how they imagine their spiritual structures, right? I have to go to my sheikh, and my sheikh is going to go through his sheikhs all the way to the Rasul is going to take me to God. And I'm going to go to my ulama, who are going to go up, go all the way up to Imam Abu Hanifa, who's my hero. And that's going to take me back to Rasul, going to take me to God. Everything's through intermediaries. Now, when there is a massive shift in the political thinking, people, there's also the shift in their theological thinking. And that's not to say that there weren't these kind of direct relationship traditions prior to the coming of colonial powers and the changes that happened in modernity. The most famous, obviously, being everybody's, but aren't popular, right?
Minority in their context.
Exactly. They're not the dominant position within their traditions. And then you see an explosion of their thought. Shouldn't say explosion as a Muslim. You see an exponential increase in their thought, in their influence over the next, starting from like 1800 until now, right?
That's
now, like
change of society and thought process.
Exactly. You go, Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah is not, he's almost a political theological statement, right? You go to someone's house and the Fatawa Ibn Taymiyyah on his wall, right? My man hasn't read a single book of fiqh with anybody, but he has Majmu' al-Fatawa on his library, right?
Yeah.
That's a political statement, right? It's a political theological statement about a particular orientation of theology. Whereas if you go you go to somebody's house and in his library, the Futuhat Makkiyah or things like that, right? That's also a political theological statement. Or Dean in like multiple editions across his library. Okay, I get it. But these things, when these thinkers like Ghazali, like Ibn Arabi, like Ibn Taymiyyah, like Ibn al-Qayyim, Allah to all of them, when they stop, they don't have just a role in the way people imagine their religious life anymore, or like the details of their religious life. It has to do with the very way that they think about their relationship between them and God, between them and other people, between them and hierarchies. That's what they're communicating. That's what people are communicating. And that is what their real effect becomes in the modern world. Taking all of this back to the original question of how does colonialism have this massive impact on the Muslim way of thinking, is that colonialism comes to societies that are deeply hierarchical, that are deeply embedded in there's a massive epistemological change as well within Western thought. And you can take that all the way back to the Renaissance with the humanist tradition, right? A lot of people, by the way, this is a pet peeve of mine. A lot of people go on and on about liberalism, right? Like, oh, Muslim liberalism.
Mhm.
And they dump your decolonial Marxists with your Hillary Clinton liberals, with your Rousseaus and your John Locke's and your Rawls, and they're like, oh, all of it is liberal. That's like putting a Sufi and a Salafi together and being like, oh, all y'all Wahhabis, right? There's it's what you're actually saying. What the actual critique is, the critique of the humanist tradition that comes out of the Renaissance, and all these different iterations of it are different iterations of the humanist tradition from the Renaissance. And the biggest change in the humanist tradition that takes place is it's not even a cosmological change, right? That comes later. Like the Renaissance thinkers, when they're writing and they're like Descartes, for example, right? Like when he's writing, he's not sitting there going, oh, I am going to dislodge God from the center of the universe. He's a very devout person himself.
Right. It's like much later as things develop and people are changing and their worldviews are changing, their sense of self and relationship with religion changes. All these things come much later, but it's not like the original thinkers themselves had a particular agenda of advancing atheism or secularism necessarily.
Exactly. And like all of those things come together in very insignificant ways because of multiple factors, right? Now, there's almost never one thing that leads to another one thing, right? There's like always multiple causes that have multiple effects that have multiple causes. It's just unfortunately the way the universe works. It would be so much more simple if it worked like kicking a ball. Boy walks up to ball, boy kicks, ball goes far, boy made ball go far. Like very simple, right? Unfortunately, that's not how human society works. There's always multifaceted causes with multifaceted effects that are all interlinked that have other multifaceted effects. But Descartes in himself, he has no desire to dislodge God from the center of the universe. But the thought that starts in the Renaissance, right? Particularly the epistemological thought that starts in the Renaissance, has certain effects when married with other things that are happening in Europe at the time, that eventually leads to dislodging God from not just the epistemological center of the universe, but the moral center of the universe. And it starts with the way that Europeans begin to think about knowledge itself, right? There's a straw man that is often put forward by atheists that are like, oh, we believe in rationality, we believe in science, we believe in the empirical investigation and things like that, as if people who believe in God don't believe in any of that.
Right.
But like the reason why they say that is because for them, and this kind of goes all the way back to the Renaissance tradition, is that all that exists is the universe. There is nothing but the universe. And the only way you can understand anything epistemologically, right, is the universe. So what ends up then happening is you have this massive change within the way that people think in terms of knowledge, that knowledge is only ever going to be within the universe. And so now we have to think about things only in the universe. And that eventually starts to thinking that goes all the way down to the radical epistemological shifts that happen in the Muslim world. All of which is to say that the way that Muslims are affected by Western conquest of Muslim lands is not just even in intellectual ways, but it's a deep decentering of the way they imagine the entire universe, and that has consequences for the entirety of Muslim society.
So that fundamental change originated with gunpowder, led to shakeups of society, led to an essential rupture in how Muslims in particular had built our entire existence, essentially, as an ummah, as a spiritual tradition, a political tradition, and left us with the hot mess we've got now. Would that be
Basically.
accurate? All right. So then now I want to shift towards the article that you wrote for Muslim Matters, The Tolling Bell of Revolution. In that article, you focus on Allamah Iqbal's poetry and his general perspectives on Islamic revolution, one based firmly upon Islamic beliefs, principles, and practices. Now, why did he choose Allamah Iqbal as your focus? Like, I found the entire introduction that you provided to him really interesting because he didn't come from an isolated, quote unquote, Eastern background. He was very well educated. He had an understanding of Western philosophies as well, but he came out with a unique approach of his own. So, could you share that with us, please?
Sure. So I think Iqbal's like a great. I'm a giant fanboy. I am a traveling missionary of Iqbal. And I always have to hold myself from like erupting into singing one of his poems. I get up every day in the morning just chanting one of his poems. It's just, I'm a big Iqbal fanboy. But so what I mean by that is whatever I say, just take it with a giant grain of salt. Not in a, not, I definitely have rose tinted glasses when I'm talking about Iqbal. Iqbal is really interesting because he is doing something doing something very subtly that a lot of other people miss. People that are coming from the Islamist tradition or people coming from Islamic revivalism or any kind of Islam reform movement, they miss a lot of his methodology for some of his conclusions. And the core of Iqbal's methodology is, you can think of it as compare and contrast, but it's very similar to what a later philosopher, a French philosopher by the name of Michel Foucault does. And it's this idea of genealogy. And the idea of genealogy is basically that things that you think don't have history and things that you think don't necessarily, like the idea hasn't evolved. It's like a idea that's been there forever. It has evolved and it is different from things in the past. And someone who really truly understands that very deeply is it. One example of this is he has this debate with Maulana Madani, who basically becomes one of the chief defenders of the Indian nationalism for Congress. Because at the time, the Congress Party was like the biggest opposition force to the British, and the Muslim League, which later became the All Indian Muslim League, which later became the Pakistan Muslim League, was like its counterpart on the Muslim side. And Maulana Madani, his entire idea was to like find places in the Quran and the Sunnah that showed that there was an importance to have a nationalist enterprise or like a common group enterprise, so that if he could justify that, he could justify resistance against the British. He could justify resistance against the British through that theory that he's building. And Iqbal had a series of debates with him about the dangers of that. And his idea, what he was saying wasn't that the danger is the resistance or anything like that. Iqbal was very anti-colonial towards the end of his life. The danger for him was in taking a Western concept, slapping a Muslim veneer on it, and being like, ta-da, this is Muslim
Right.
now.
And this
Right?
is something that obviously we are continuing to contend with and struggle with these approaches today.
Yes, but we contend with those, we struggle with those, even from people who 100% consider themselves to be not Western, right? One of the examples I give on this always is I have a really good friend, Omar Sharif, who's doing his PhD with me, and he's 1 year above me. He's about to graduate soon, inshallah, and he's going to write basically like his dissertation is on this concept called taqid al-mubah, which I'm not going to get into because that's going to be a whole tangent. But the basic idea, one of the things that he started searching through that is the evolving conceptions of women in domesticity in the Muslim world.
Now, this is my jam.
Imagine you
We'll
would
keep this for a
enjoy
separate
this.
podcast.
And I always had this sneaking suspicion since the best thing I ever did was my English degree, by the way. Because it just, you get exposed to so much thought reading through literature that you don't get exposed to and everything. But that's another tangent. Okay, I had this like sneaking suspicion the entire way through because I was constantly reading these defenses of the Sharia in later Muslim thought, whether it's Maududi or it's some of the Egyptian writers or things like that, or Iqbal himself, and was like, but these ideas that they're coming with are literally copy paste from the 1700s.
Very Victorian era.
It's actually even pre-Victorian.
Oh, there you go. Okay.
So post 1600s, there, as a humanist tradition starts, there's like this question of what's a human? Are women humans? And there's like this discussion on whether or not women are like even have full mental capacity. Well, yeah, the Catholic Church, that was definitely the Catholic Church, where women didn't have souls until like the 1800s. But there was this question about whether or not women even had rational capacity. And almost every argument that you find in the late 1800s about why the Sharia doesn't allow women to, like, why the Sharia has two women to one male witnesses, or why women can't do XYZ, almost every single rationalizing argument is found about 100 years earlier in what was known as the quote unquote women question in Europe.
Mhm.
And the women question is about whether women are rational, whether women can actually think, whether women are suited to doing anything that requires human capacity. And
The framing of emotional versus rational is something that I personally have found. Like when we look at the Sunnah, we never see that discussion, full stop. And then it just floods the discussion in our more contemporary-ish discussions. And I would argue, as Sheikh Akram Nadwi does, that even in a lot of earlier Muslim works, obviously like just after the Tabi'een, a lot of it comes from Greek philosophy. And obviously I get really salty about that because we all focus on how the Greeks impacted Aqidah and quote unquote Islamic philosophy and things like that. And we'll argue about that till the end of time. But there's almost no recognition of how their thought process about women impacted our entire communal thought process about women as well. And then from the Greeks, we just ended up taking everything else from Europe too.
oh my God, girl, you're about to send me off on a tangent, like massive. I'm about, like, when we start talking about Greek effects on Muslim way of thinking, it's just it's
That's the
unimaginable.
decolorization that should have happened first.
Oh my God, 100%. 100%. The kind of tea on the ihya, right, is always, oh, what Imam Ghazali was doing is he was incorporating, sorry, he was bringing tasawwuf and fiqh together into one tradition. That's not what he was doing. He was taking the Greek philosophical tradition, the kalam tradition, and fiqh, and marrying it all together.
Yep.
Because if you look at the way the great Greeks hated women, right?
Yep.
Absolutely
Blazing
hated women.
passion.
To the Greeks, if everybody could just be men, the world would be better. But because for some reason Providence decided there's going to be women, we just have to put up with them. And that kind of thinking definitely goes into Muslim thought, but it actually affects everything, right? One of the biggest effects on tasawwuf is Stoicism. It has a massive effect on tasawwuf. And Stoicism comes into tasawwuf through monasticism and like the Christian tradition, which has an effect on early tasawwuf.
Right.
Now, I just want to make this very clear. I have nothing against tasawwuf, right? A lot of my family with tasawwuf, things like that. I have nothing against tasawwuf. Just, I'm
We
just
need to be
saying
honest about how our traditions developed and what they incorporated.
exactly, right? Like there are parts of tasawwuf where you're just like, but have you read the Sunnah though?
Exactly. Yep.
You know what I mean?
Careful if people are going to start calling us Salafi.
It's like, I'm not Salafi, but I have my own critiques of tasawwuf. Like, for example, that there's the whole discourse on zuhud and the whole discourse on asceticism, not as a tool, but as a virtue and a value in and of itself. And you read the lives of Sahaba and you're like, yeah, you have people like Abu Darda, radhiyallahu anh, but you also have people like Abdurrahman bin Auf, radhiyallahu anh, and you have people like Uthman bin Affan, radhiyallahu anh, right?
Abu Darda radiallahu anhu, you have Salman al-Farisi coming to him and be like, yo, you can't be doing that.
Yeah, a bit much, bro, right? But again, that's disagreements among Sahaba, and we don't really necessarily have to take sides. But the reality is that for every one of the ascetic Sahaba, you have multiple non-ascetic Sahaba. And there are multitudes of stories of Sahaba that just don't mesh with Stoicism, and they don't mesh with later practices of the Mutasawwifa. And the Mutasawwifa always have this, they always have a get out of jail free card, right? Which is also get out of jail free card that the fuqaha use quite a bit. And that is everybody's favorite line, Fasad al-Zaman. Because society has degraded as it has, we can no longer continue the practice of the way the Sahaba did. We have to be more stringent, because if we don't, society's already gone to hell, is going to go to hell even more. It's like a rectifying principle. And that's basically how a lot of things are justified. It's Fasad al-Zaman. And this interesting thing about women is that you find the early generation of women to be very dynamic, right? You find them to be scholars, you find them to be involved in the markets, you find them to be involved even in war making, things like that. But as things kind of progress, and especially after the incorporation of the Greek philosophical tradition, a lot of that goes downhill.
Another thing that
And,
Trevor notes about just like how even female hadith scholarship just like what tanked for so long after, like pretty much parallel to the introduction of Greek philosophy into Muslim thought.
yeah, so the introduction of Greek philosophical tradition to me is, it has its uses, but this is where I always have my rule of thumb, which is if your philosophy, if your way of thinking can't make sense of either the life of the Sahaba or the Rasul in its totality, not individual reports, but in its totality, then to me, your thought doesn't make sense. Because at the end of the day, my yardstick has been given to me by God.
Exactly.
And that yardstick is the Rasul, the yardstick is the Sahaba. And if I can try to justify why I'm not going to use that yardstick, but that at the end of the day is just a justification of it. Anyways, this going somehow we've got to this from Iqbal. How do we get this from Iqbal?
It was a great rabbit hole, though.
I'm a big rabbit hole fan. Okay, love rabbits. So the issue. So what Iqbal does is Iqbal kind of looks at a whole bunch of concepts, whether that's concepts on like things like qadar, time, space, concepts of like state, concepts of conception of self, things like that. And what he does is he does what I call critical theology, which is he takes these questions and he brings them back to the Quran. And he says, okay, let me take these questions that are present in Western philosophy and in Western social thought, and we bring them back to the Quran and ask these questions from a Quranic lens, right?
Right here.
One of the major deficiencies in Iqbal is that he doesn't engage with the hadith as much. He does engage with hadith, right? Like his favorite hadith was La tasubbu ad-dahr. And in fact, there's this philosopher Henry Bergson, and Henry Bergson had this whole theory on time that Iqbal really liked. And so when he met Henry Bergson in France, he told him this hadith. He quoted it to him. He said, "Oh, God says La tasubbu ad-dahr." It actually blew Henry Bergson's mind, because of the philosophical implications of the hadith. But anyways, that's a completely different tangent. But he has these ideas, right? These ideas of, he has these questions that are coming out of some of the Western tradition, some of the Eastern tradition, because he's fairly conversant in both. And he's, okay, let me look at them in the Quran and what the Quranic concept of these things are. And then let me see what it is today. And then let me try to map the change. Like, why are things different?
Right.
And so he's doing what I call critical theology, but also it's a kind of genealogy. It's taking the concept, pulling it back and seeing like where it differs, where it changes, and what the more Quranic concept is. And this is why when Maulana Madani is talking about what we call wataniyat, which is nationalism basically, but it's belonging to the nation, belonging to the country. And he has some kind of Islamic defenses of it. The Iqbal goes back and says, no, that you've completely misunderstood this. And you're fixated on this word qawm in the Quran, but that's not the actual word that God uses, that Allah Ta'ala uses for Muslims. The word he uses for Muslims is millah, right? Millat abikum Ibrahim. And millah is the word that's used in like traditionally for Muslims as well. And he's okay. So what is a millah? What does millah mean? What does millah mean in a modern context? And so he's one of the most interesting things about it, because people sometimes think I think Iqbal's perfect. Like, I am very consciously aware of Iqbal's deficiencies. He has a lot of deficiencies, like every human being does. But his methodology is extremely important. And his methodology is one that is not just about, there are later Islamic thinkers, like Islamist thinkers, like Maududi or Qutb or things that they don't even realize it, but they have internalized a lot of Western thought.
Yes.
They have internalized a lot of Western conceptions and concepts.
Those, as so many of us do, really. And I guess to some extent we can't help it because we're not aware of our own tradition. We haven't done as Allamah Iqbal did, which is the genealogy bit that you describe, where we are making arguments based on assumptions that we've internalized as being universal, but they are actually quite Eurocentric.
Exactly. And I'm gonna put a pin on that, and I'm gonna come back to it in half a second. And what Iqbal does is that his methodology is what I call critical theology, and I think is extremely important. Is a methodology that has to be the methodology that we push him. How many birds am I gonna ruffle? How many feathers am I gonna ruffle when I say this? I am very pessimistic about tradition for tradition's sake. Right? I don't venerate the tradition.
Right.
I think it's important. It provides a really good lens for things.
Yeah.
And there are certain things like fiqh where I'm deeply tied to the Hanafi school, right?
Mhm.
I'm Hanafi in all things except for three. And I think that is because intellectually you have to have a rigorous way of being able to do your law, and there's no need to recreate the wheel. But the actual implementation of it, the received cultural values and received traditional values, whatnot, I have absolutely zero loyalty to it. The only loyalty I have to anything is to the Quran and to the Sunnah. So I'm a little bit Salafi in that, because at the end of the day, the only thing I have loyalty to in my life is Allah and His Messenger. I love my biryani, but I have no loyalty to biryani.
Right.
Right. And for a lot of people, the reason why they're post-colonial is because they couldn't eat biryani for lunch at school. And
Yeah, that is a recurring theme in a lot of people's memoirs. But anyways, go on.
so so what it comes down to is, for me, the reason why critical theology and Iqbal's methodology is so important is because it can expose to us not only where Western thought became or has affected us in ways that we're not aware of, but it also exposes us to how the Islamic tradition as it developed is as much a development of its own cultural and historical specificities and is not necessarily the only interpretation of Quran and Sunnah. That leads us to a much bigger question, which is, why are we decolonial in the first place?
Yes.
Right? What is the point of it all? And I'm going to be real with you. If I wasn't Muslim, I wouldn't be decolonial.
Yeah, I agree. I think a lot of us would be that way, actually.
I think that's the only real way you can be, because at the end of the day, like, cultures, societies, histories, traditions, they go up and they go down. They stick around, they disappear. That's just the ebb and flow of the
Cycles of
universe.
history, and they change, and human nature is human nature, essentially. I think with whether we're talking about decoloniality or really anything else, if you have a foundation of, as you said, I'm only loyal to Quran and Sunnah, those are my reference points for existence. Those are my reference points for how I conceptualize myself and my role in the world and my purpose in life. Then that is such a fundamentally, foundationally radical perspective that, again, if it were not for Islam, there'd be so many things that we would not think about, we would not consider, we would not have a rock solid foundation to start with anyways. We would not be putting our nafs in check, which is, again, a lot of this. Like, I would say a, a non-religious decolonial perspective is very much based on your nafs and your perspective of things like, do I have power or not? Am I being oppressed or not? Not because oppression is inherently wrong, because it doesn't feel good to me. You know what I mean?
And let's take this one step further. Let's take that basic question that you just outlined, take it one step further, right? If God doesn't exist, why the heck do I care what anybody else feels?
Mm-hmm.
In the sense that, okay, let's say colonialism and imperialism, all that it's bad. Okay, it's bad. Fine, it's bad. We all agree it's bad. But if I get to be on top, is it really that bad?
Yep, exactly.
You know, and what argument can you give to me morally that it's my moral imperative to make sure that I am not on top?
And that itself
Right?
goes back to the question of morality. Where does it come from if you don't believe that it comes from God?
Very much, right? And this is why when I talk about decolonization and post-colonialism, that they are embedded within a Marxist framework. What we have to understand is that Marxism is an impulse to marry Western humanist ideas of morality with the organization of society. And what Marx is basically doing in Capital and in his writings in general, what Marx is basically doing is he's pointing out all the ways in which the economic system in particular, but the social hierarchical arrangements in general, are incompatible with the moral imperatives of humanist iterations of morality, which are focused on equality and focused on fairness, fairness through equality, right? And that way of thinking is then pulled into decolonization and postcolonialism, and that's why they have certain kinds of tensions with Islamic thought.
Mm-hmm.
But the question that has always plagued Marxism, and that Marxism, this is really the question why Marxism has been so unpopular in so many places, is that okay, let's say it is unequal, but why is that bad?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, other people feel other people are disenfranchised. Why should I care if I get to have my house and my car and my vacations and my? Why should I care? From a completely secular perspective, there's no akhirah, there's no God, there's no anything. Why do I care if I'm taking vacations at the expense of the lady who's serving me my vacations?
Yep.
And I've never found a really powerful answer to that. The only answer I've found to that is Allah.
Exactly. Yep.
You should care because Allah, right? But that, if you should care because Allah, you should care about Allah and then care about what Allah cares about. And that's also like Iqbal's kind of framework when he functions in that way. It's like primary to everything is the love of God. And so primary to everything is the love of Allah. Now, when we come to like Islamic decoloniality, or I didn't even like that term. I'm working on my own kind of term. I've not 100% gotten it, but it's basically it comes back to had this idea of what's called khudi, which is like it's selfness. You could almost think about it like a healthy ego. And he asked one of his friends asked him, "Where'd you get this concept from?" He said, "Go get the Quran." He got the Quran. He said, "Open it to Surah Hashr." And he opened it to Surah Hashr. He said, "Read ayah 19, I think." And he said, "Okay." And it was, and it's this idea that when you forget Allah, Allah makes you forget who you are.
Yes.
And so what he's saying is when you remember Allah, you remember who you are. And that you have value for yourself through Allah. And that is the framework that I'm thinking about, which is it has nothing to do. I don't care if like globalization is erasing biryani or like commercializing it. Who cares? Really, who cares? I don't care for one, right? The only thing I care about is my relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, my love of Allah, and the role that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given me as a Muslim, which is, Iqbal outlines this a lot when every good Sunday school student is taught what's the purpose of existence. Everybody's taught that. But the thing that's often overlooked is, right? And for Iqbal, it's okay, ibadah is important, but the role of the human being on earth is khilafah. The role of the human being on earth is to be, and when I say khilafah, almost like you hear the cheers of 1,000 neo-traditionalists who are like, we're going to revive the khilafah, right? That's not what Iqbal means by khilafah. What he means by khilafah, which he doesn't mind, by the way, he doesn't mind the idea of a khalifa.
Here's the khilafah of each and every one of us fulfilling that role in our capacities.
Exactly. And what's really interesting is like when I start talking about this, a lot of Muslims intuitively understand this concept, and they're intuitively understanding this concept because it's coming from it, and it proliferates around the world in many different ways and becomes just a very intuitive way in which Muslims imagine their Islam now. But it really, during his time, like this was not something that was said in this way. But it's okay. So my relationship, my only loyalty is to Allah and His Messenger. And when I look at what Allah wants from me, Allah wants ubudiyah from me. But the ubudiyah that He wants from me has a particular manifestation. And that manifestation is khilafah. And that khilafah is that I have to act as the hand of God on earth. And if I don't act as the hand of God on earth, then I am derelict in my duty as a human being to my Creator.
Yes.
And then the question becomes, how do you become the hand of God on earth? And that's when you go down a rabbit hole. That's the rabbit hole that Iqbal wants you to go down. And that's the question of what are all of the impediments that are keeping you from being the hand of God on earth. And he has this line in this poem called Sultani, where he says, this khilafah is not one of violence and domination, but it's one of love, and it's basically one of love and mutual mercy. And what that means is that just as Allah, He is the most powerful and He is the most absolute, but His most predominant name in the Quran, and the only one that He uses as synonym for Himself, is Ar-Rahman, which comes from the word of Rahmah. And even the sending of the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam was an act of Rahmah. And it's in that exact same way that the khilafah of the human in his own life and the communal khilafah of Muslims is a khilafah of Rahmah. Sometimes Rahmah also has to be, there's a Jamali Rahmah, and there's the Rahmah, like it is, if you see a person fall in the street and you run to him, you pick him up in the street, that's a Jamali Rahmah. If you see somebody being beat upside the head for no reason on the street, and you run to them and you throw his attacker to the side and say, hey, hands off, that's it. That's also rahmah, but that's a jidali rahmah. And so you have the necessity of human beings to embody that divine name of rahmah in their khilafah. But to do that, you have to have certain series of prerequisites. And one of those prerequisites is, when I say the word rahmah to you, right? What immediately jumps out to you? What words are associated with it?
I'm a mom, so with me it comes up the conception of motherhood, right? And we always talk about rahma and rahim and the womb, the connections to the womb. So yeah, for me, it's all about motherhood. And as a mom, I know that when you have rahma for your kid, it doesn't just mean cuddling them all day, every day. It means equipping them with the tools to be tough enough so that they can handle the real world. And sometimes that means you gotta let them fall down and scrape their knees and cry a little bit, and then teach them how to get up and keep at it.
For me, and I agree entirely with the kind of parent analogy, right? Mom and dad and rahma. But there's a certain thing that's embedded even in that analogy, and that's power.
Good
You
point.
can't have rahma without power. See, the difference between affection and mercy is power. Uh, uh, love without power is affection,
Hmm.
and love with power is mercy.
That's a
And
great definition.
the thing is that when you have affection for people, might like you, right? But they ain't gonna do nothing for you. When you are loving and generous and whatnot with people, and you have power, right? Now you're able to mold things in such a way that you're not just merciful yourself, you are creating mercy through your power. And this is I'm not going to, I'm saying this right now just for myself. I am not going to go into a tangent about American Muslim politics. But I am going to say that one of the issues that we have as Muslims is half of us have this mentality that, you know what, the pursuit of power is evil and terrible and disastrous, and it's bad for your nafs and for your soul, and therefore we're going to say that the world is ending soon anyways, and we're going to go live in Berkeley. The other half of us are going to no, we have to pursue power at all costs,
Hmm.
and we're going to do everything to just be powerful.
I think that's gonna solve our problems.
Exactly. We become powerful. Everything's good. Everything's good. Everything's good. Right now we're powerful. There is a way to square that circle, and there is somewhere my friends are laughing because, oh my god, you said square the circle again. That's like my favorite term. There's a way to square the circle, and the way you square the circle is that, yes, power is extremely important. And I think now in the Muslim world, in this moment in particular, everything happening in Gaza, Muslims are far less allergic to the word power than they used to be. But power is important because without power, you don't have any ability to shape anything at all. You can't safeguard yourself. You can't safeguard others. You can't advocate for a better world, anything. But power without the goal of rahmah it's spiritual disease. And the way that this goal of rahmah always plays out in the end is that there's a lot of people who are like, we will become at the end, right? Like Yusuf Aisam's brothers, right?
We'll do the bad thing and then we'll be good afterwards, and that'll make up for it.
Exactly, right? Oh, we'll get power, and then we'll be good. We'll do whatever we need to get power, and then we'll be good. And for me, the yardstick is that if your mode of gaining power is not rahmah itself, then your power was meaningless from the very beginning. And this is a very super difficult tightrope to walk. And that is taqwa. The walking that tightrope is taqwa. And there is zero way of substituting for taqwa. You can't bureaucratize taqwa. But this is the reality, is that if you want to fulfill your human destiny, the very point of your existence of khilafah that Allah has imbued you with, then the only way to do it is through rahmah, embodying the most predominant quality of Allah. You can only embody that predominant quality of Allah if you have power. But that power is meaningless if you don't do it through rahmah itself.
Be able to provide just a summary of the Iqbalian thought regarding colonization? Just give me like a two-liner, and then we can move on to the next tangent.
Sure. Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm a really bad rabbit hole person. I just love rabbits and I follow them everywhere. The two-liner is very simple. Colonialism only functions because we allow it to. We only allow it to because we are forgotten our role in the universe. Our role in the universe is khilafa, and khilafa is done through like a series of things like rahma, power, and being really good at all the crafts and skills of the world. And also through love of Allah and connection to spirituality and connection to each other.
Thank you. So I love that because it establishes, again, a different way of thinking about how we can be quote unquote decolonial, right? And I'm using this term only because it's what's out there to describe pushing back against colonization and extracting ourselves from it. And again, like these discussions of like, oh, Islamic decoloniality are so embedded in that other framework that slapped a Muslim sticker on it and doesn't look at what already exists. For me, that's like my pet peeve when Muslims want to talk about decoloniality, and either they just spend all the time in the world being like, because all of it is just based on Marxist thought or non-Muslim thought, just even the discussion itself is wrong to have and it's a waste of time or whatever. Or on the flip side, it's just throwing ourselves wholeheartedly at the structures that already exist and be like, oh, we're Muslim, let's just Muslimize it a little bit and keep running with it. For me, what I really want to see is Muslim responses to colonization that come from our tradition, not for tradition's sake, but looking at frameworks that have already been established, whether it's, as you've described so well, Allamah Iqbal's perspective, which again, Quran and Sunnah, right? Like we have an amazing foundation to turn to that provides us guidance on how to react to all of these phenomenon, political, social, cultural, whatever it is. And I've noticed, again, I'm a total layperson. I'm barely conversant and aware of other tracks of quote unquote decoloniality from our history, but enough to be aware of the fact that we actually have a very long-standing tradition of Islamic decoloniality that comes primarily from Islam itself. And I do like that you originally differentiate between anti-coloniality versus decoloniality as academic thought. But just to conflate them a little bit here, we've got Umar Musta's resistance against the Italians. We had the Indonesian Admiral Manhayati, who was a woman, by the way, her defense against the Dutch and Portuguese. And, there were so many other incredible mujahideen of the Malay, Indonesian regions who fought militarily and politically against those colonizers. Then you had Sayyid Qutb critiquing Western influence on Egyptian politics and society. All of that exists. We have sources to turn to. You have Allamah Iqbal, as you said, who developed incredible thought on this topic. And so why aren't we going back to this? Why aren't we looking to what they've already provided? And we're not saying that they figured it all out and they all got it perfect, but what would you say are the common themes of Islamic decoloniality that we can take lessons from the traditions of these previous generations who didn't live that long ago either? We'd like to say, like, oh, our context is so different. It's so unique. We are a generation dealing with issues that the Muslim world has never seen before. I would actually argue we've seen a lot of this before. The difference is just we live in modernity and technology has progressed more than anyone could ever have imagined. But the broad strokes of it all kind of did happen before, and we're dealing with the continuation of that.
I think the most important thing for Muslims is to stop living in opposition and to start living in themselves. And what I mean by that is whenever we talk about decoloniality or colonialism or this or whatnot, the other, it is always in the context of how do we be not Western? How do we oppose the West? How do we stand against Western thought, Western culture, Western imperialism? And what that gets most stuck in is a politics, is a theology, is an imagination of the self as the opposite or as standing in opposition.
Yes.
And that can not only is it dangerous because it becomes very reactionary, but it's dangerous because it has a deep psychological effect on people. And that effect is that the agency of the other is primary and my agency only comes after theirs, right? Where if I can only ever react to what somebody else does,
It's putting
they
ourselves
do
in a position of weakness to begin with.
exactly, right? And what is so powerful, again, I'm always going to go back to Iqbal because he's my boy. All right. Not only my Pakistani, but he's just my boy. Okay. But this is one of the most powerful things about Iqbalian thought. It's that it is not a it's not a critique even. It's not even a criticism of Western thought itself, although he does engage in criticism of the West. Iqbal's thought is about what is the Muslim and what is the role of the Muslim and how does the Muslim become what the Muslim is always meant to be, what the very purpose of his creation is. And I say this in response to your question because one of the reasons why I hate the decolonial framework is that the decolonial framework is one that exists mostly as a framework of opposition, a framework of reaction and revolution, really. Whereas for Iqbalian thought and his framework, it is something that comes out of the self to aspire to be what God wants you to be.
So
Allah,
it's
yeah.
building something that is unique to us. It's looking to the Quran and Sunnah to see that vision that Allah already gave us and then actualizing it and see what that means to us and living that. And a natural consequence of doing that is going to be successfully decolonizing ourselves, essentially.
I don't even like the framing of it being unique to us.
Mm.
Like,
Elaborate.
okay, what if it's not unique to us, right? What if it's the most basic thing possible, right? That is the most basic thing in every tradition. I'm not saying it is, but let's say it is, right?
Mhm.
So what? Let's say it has a whole bunch of overlap with Western thought. So what? At the
You're
end
doing
of the
there, yeah.
day, right? At the end of the day, it's about Allah.
Mhm.
It's not about me. It's not about who I am. It's not about me being different. It's not about me being unique. It's not about me at all. It's never about me. It was never about me. It was about Allah always.
Mhm.
And it was about what he wants me to be when he placed me on this earth. So let's say that there's parts of Western thought that has unlocked that. And there's parts of Indian thought that unlock that. And there's parts of Marxist thought that unlock that. And there's overlaps between all of them. So what?
Mhm.
Right? It's you find it wherever it is. And at the end of the day, its core value has to be the burning love for Allah. It has to be the burning desire to be an embodiment of the messenger of Allah. Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. The everything else is secondary. And when we make when we think in terms of how are others oppressing us and how do we oppose them in ways that are authentic to us, it becomes very self-centered. And when we instead change it to what does Allah want me to be and why am I not that and what are the impediments to me becoming that and how do I overcome them, that is God-centered.
I like that framing. That is an interesting differentiation between the two, and I think it's one that obviously most people don't conceive of. I would say that amongst the more religiously inclined, um that is embedded there. Yes, of course, what does Allah want from me? But maybe specifying it to the context of discussions of colonization or anti-colonization or decolonization, however you want to frame that, is more that focus, right? Along those lines, 'cause I would argue again, as you said with the by reminding us to keep Allah's pleasure and Allah's love as our central focus, then that will come with so many other natural consequences, right? And then would you say that same focus was shared by other Muslim thinkers or other Muslim anti-colonizers. Because obviously we're not thinking, the reality is that when Muslims were physically fighting against colonization in their lands, they weren't sitting and developing intellectual tradition to justify or rationalize it, right? They pretty much were like, we are Muslims. These are our lands, the lands of Islam. Our deen teaches us to fight for justice and to fight back. We're going to do that. Would you say that essentially embodies what Allamah Iqbal was developing as a significant thought?
I mean, for some of them, for sure. Abdul Qaid Jazairi, Umar Mukhtar, like that. I mean, people like that definitely were the Chechen resistance, things like that, very much. But it's not always like that, right? There are others that are basically protecting their worldly power, right?
Mhm.
Like Ataturk, for example. Do you really think Ataturk cared about what God wanted,
Yeah.
right? But Ataturk was anti-colonial. Like, he resisted the British. He established the Republic of Turkey. The thing is that for some people it was, for some people it wasn't, for some people it was mixed, for some people it was not there at all. Like, it's a big mixed thing, right? One of the things that I'm really interested in is the psychology of domination. And Frantz Fanon obviously is one of the major writers on this for the kind of secular tradition. But like I said, it's always going to go back to this man for me. But this was one of the major aspects of Iqbal, right? And ever had the misfortune of coming across my Instagram, I am Mr. Mental Health Man. And for people who hear me speak on or talk to me on a regular basis, they're like, wow, you are far more interested in politics and far more interested in theory and philosophy and things like that. But your Instagram is all like Mr. Mental Health Man. Why is that? And to me, it's because the core problem of domination is one of psychology. And what it teaches us is to subjugate ourselves through the way that we think and through the way that we imagine the world. And the reason why I bring that up is because there are certain thinkers whose entire psychologies are ones in which they are in fierce resistance to their own feeling of subjugation.
Mm.
And there are certain thinkers who their psychology is one where they don't even feel dominated,
Mhm.
right? And the difference is when you are obsessed with your own subjugation, you are constantly triggered by anything that makes you feel subjugated.
And so you're essentially putting yourself in a perpetual state of victimhood.
Exactly. And you're almost like you're very reactionary. You don't take nuance very well. This is all coming out of that feeling of subjugation and a desperation to not be subjugated. And that also comes out with an intense hate for your subjugators. And that hatred has huge effects. So for example, sometimes they might have really good answers for things, but you're absolutely unwilling to listen to it because you hate them.
Or you equate, again, your own stance as being a complete opposition. You can't accept anything from it. I don't want to do the low blow of picking on Dioband, but we see a lot of the consequences of that where, oh, why are you speaking English? Why are you wearing pants? Why are you doing this, that, and the other? Because that's what they do. And we define ourselves as not that.
This is going to be okay. Give me a little bit of a tangent here.
Go for it.
I actually really like the Deobandis, but I like the Deobandi tradition, right? There's three parts to it. There's the Deobandi tradition early, there's Deobandi subculture today, and the Deobandi tradition as it's evolved, right? It's very
Right.
easy to see the Deobandis as one big group that agrees on everything. But the Deobandis were very, especially early on, right? Whether they were very dynamic in their thought, in their way they were approaching things like that. The subculture has evolved in a particular way.
So I suppose that's what I'm referring to, really.
Yeah, there's a certain reactionary nature to certain subcultures, right? And I'm not 100% down with the reactionary natures to things, but at the same time I can also respect, let me put it this way, I have as much respect for the reactionary nature of the Deobandis as I have for the reactionary nature of the more liberal types. I
Mhm.
am not the type of person who sees either one of them as enemies,
Right.
or who sees either one of them as like people I'm unwilling to work with because you've sold out Islam or you're the reason for our backwardness or whatever. I see merit in actually everybody, and I see merit in what everybody had Everybody was dealing with a separate question of the colonial enterprise. And they were all trying to answer the same question, which is how do we protect Islam and Muslims? But they were answering it from different lenses. And I think the moment that you like that anybody starts seeing them like this subculture or this group of people or that group of people is the problem, you focus entirely on what they missed and are not able to focus on what they got more. It's a lot more fruitful, productive to be able to be like, okay, let me talk to the more like Western educated liberal types and see what they got right. Let me talk to the Deobandis and see what they got right. Let me talk to the Barelvis and see what they got right. Let me talk to the Salafis and see what they got right. Let me talk to the don't talk to Qadianis, but let me talk to all these people and see what they got. And once I can amalgamate, I can take your right and your right and your right and try to leave off your wrong and put it together and see where that synthesis takes us.
Okay, I
That's
like
my
that. I like that a
answer.
lot. So now to round off this entire discussion, let's go back to how we can make this practical, right? So these discussions of decoloniality that tend to exist within ivory towers, they're very disconnected from the real world in a lot of ways. And then on the other hand, we've got like discussions of revolution and excitement about it, but those tend to fizzle out over nights at the coffee shop. So what do you think we collectively need to do as an ummah to move on from the chattering and actually start developing a strong global Islamic resistance against colonization and its tentacles, but I think based on what we've already talked about, not defining ourselves as the other, maybe just in general. Like, how do we build ourselves up to be really strong?
Just note for the editor, I'm about to pop a soda can. You might want to edit that out. There we go. All right, back. So I'm really pessimistic about revolution in general. And I know fascinated by decolonization and love the whole opposition to colonialism thing. All of a sudden, really pessimistic about revolution. The reason why I'm really pessimistic about revolution is because you can count on your fingers the amount of revolutions that didn't lead to complete collapse of their societies. The only time a revolution is actually really successful is when it happens in a country that geopolitically doesn't matter.
Because otherwise, everybody's got their fingers in those pies.
Exactly right. Like, think of the first real revolution in the modern world, and that's the first really major important one. That's the French Revolution. Very immediately after the French Revolution, you had all the major powers who were like, "How do we take advantage of this in our own context?" And you saw the same thing with the Arab Spring.
Yeah.
And you like, I said this to somebody, and they were like, "Well, why do what about Sri Lanka? Sri Lanka had a really successful overthrow of their government, but I was like, who cares about Sri Lanka? If you're Sri Lankan, I love you, okay, but who cares about Sri Lanka? There is almost zero geopolitical importance of Sri Lanka except for India, and I could explain that with like sea routes and supply chains and whatnot, but this doesn't matter, right? What matters right now is that the reason why things were allowed to go in Sri Lanka as they went was because, okay, it's a bad look, but at the end of the day, like we lose Sri Lanka. What you going to do? It's not that big of a deal. You lose Syria and it's a completely different matter. You lose Yemen, it's a completely different matter. You lose Palestine, it's a completely different matter. These are geopolitically some of the most strategically important places in the world. Revolution there is not going to be tolerated. You think they're going to tolerate revolution in Egypt? Of course not. We saw that. Right. And at the end of the day, like revolution, what ends up happening with revolution is that revolution, you get caught up in these geopolitical messes, which are very difficult to actually work, that end up collapsing the society almost entirely in and of on itself. This is not to say that I'm taking the stance that others did, that, oh, you should just be quiet and sit in your house because it's worse for everybody. There's a way to square the circle. And that way is that you have to push for change and you have to push for betterment, being very cognizant that this is a fire and there's a whole bunch, like you're basically lighting a fire in a powder keg, in a warehouse of powder kegs. It's doable. It's 100% doable, right? We saw it happen across the world in the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s. It's 100% doable, but it requires a lot of very careful navigation. And I think the most important thing that it comes to that navigation is one, determination. Most coffee shop revolutions you're talking about fizzle out because lattes become more expensive. And I love revolution, but am I going to pay $7 for a latte? And what I mean by that is that revolution has economic consequences. And most people don't want to pay the economic consequence of revolution. And this is, for example, what's happening in Pakistan right now, right? What they're trying to do to Pakistan is they are like Imran Khan, his government is basically a revolution against the establishment. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to collapse the economy of Pakistan, like take it to the brink of collapse in order to get people to abandon the idea of revolution.
Yeah.
So that they lose hope. I love Imran Khan, but am I going to pay $10 for a bunch of tomatoes, right? Like it's not gonna, like, I don't want to do that.
Right, threaten people's everyday livelihood and their ability to survive, and they don't have time to think about building a just society.
Exactly. And that leads to, but what that requires is determination. And determination can only ever be built on hope. And so hope is one of the most important and key elements to that kind of, to the practical aspect of revolution. What you have a lot right now is particularly in the Western, English speaking, in particular, Muslim world, sorry, a Western world, the English speaking Western world, Muslims living there. What you have is a lot of despair, particularly happening in Palestine. And there's this intense feeling of what's the point of it all? Anyways, everything we did failed. And the reality is that nobody feels happier listening to that sentiment than the Zionists themselves. That anybody and everybody who wants to genocide the Palestinians, who wants to ethnically cleanse all of Palestine from every single one of the Palestinians, no, they are the ones who rejoice most when Muslims fall into despair.
Right.
Because if we can break our own backs, they don't got to do it for us.
So busy just being miserable and not thinking we can do anything.
Exactly. So the first element to revolution is hope. Have to have hope. And again, our hope is not in anything else. Our hope is always in Allah. Because we as Muslims, we don't believe that our acts have necessary consequences that are dictated by the laws of the universe. We believe that Allah creates everything. And because of that, all human action, all human choice is a communication between man and God. It's a communication that I am not losing hope in you. If I start to act as if there's no hope, I'm telling God I've lost hope in him. And if I
not paint that issue.
Exactly. Despair. Iqbal has this powerful line. He says, do you have hope in idols? And when he means idols, when he says idols, he means like the physical realities of the universe. Do you have hope in idols and despair in Allah? Tell me what else is kufr. And that is the very basic thing. This is the only thing that sustains the tomorrow that comes after the today, right? The only thing that sustains tomorrow is the hope of tomorrow. If you end yourself today because you have no hope in tomorrow, that tomorrow never comes. And so the very core of everything is hope. We have to have hope that in Allah. And the problem is hope is very painful, right? It's when you see these continuous videos and whatnot coming out of Palestine, of the genocide, and you have hope that it's going to stop. Every moment that it doesn't stop is like a moment of death.
Yes.
Right? Grief is like death. Ghalib has this line where he says, who should I tell what is the worst calamity? The night spent in grief is the worst calamity. I wouldn't have minded dying if it had happened only once. Right? That is grief. Grief is perpetual death. And disappointment is like grief. Right? It's perpetual death. That's why hope is like death. It's like constant death. And if you can't sustain yourself through that constant death, through hope in Allah and through holding on to that hope in Allah, you're in the end of the day, you have no opportunity for tomorrow. And that's the reality. So that's the kind of psychological aspect of it, right? The second aspect of it, there's psychological aspect, then there's the kind of elite aspect, and then there's the layperson aspect. The elite aspect is we have a crisis of leadership in the Muslim world. Massive crisis of leadership in the Muslim world. And when I look at what's happening across the, especially the English speaking Western world, Muslims living there is an absolute crisis of leadership. And there's a difference between leaders and lead followers. Leaders have vision. Leaders have theories of how things are going to get done. Leaders give directions. Leaders create coalitions. Leaders put people together and show them the way and start walking, and people follow them. Lead followers just look at which way the mob is going and gets to the front of it. We don't have strong leadership for Muslims in general around the world. There's pockets where we have strong leadership, but Muslims around the world in general does not have strong leadership. And one of the reasons why it doesn't have strong leadership is because of the perpetual negative talk, disparaging, constant attacks, and complete disunity of the Muslim public. And this is where we're going to get to the lay discussion, right? You cannot have leaders if leaders feel that every single thing they're going to do is going to get them excommunicated.
Right.
As long as leadership feels that the price of leadership is their very inclusion in the community itself, you're never going to have leaders. You're only ever going to have lead followers. The way that one of the most important ways to sustain change of the current circumstance is to empower leaders. We always think about empowerment coming from top down, but really a lot of empowerment comes bottom up. And that is, we have to give the people ability to make mistakes and to still be a part of the community. Okay, we made these political decisions. We made these gambles and we lost. All right, fine. That's okay. Because we knew that someone goes and makes a coalition with like leftists, and everybody has this question about whether or not you're sacrificing. What are you sacrificing in that discussion? It's not. He should be allowed to make that coalition, see where it goes. If it goes somewhere, all right. If it doesn't go somewhere, okay, he made it, it was a call. We didn't agree with it. But come back and we'll make another call. We do it again. This is just like, leaders have to be allowed to take risks without feeling that every risk they're going to do is going to be excommunication from the community. And leaders have to be, the other very important thing is, an individual action is almost always meaningless, with some major exceptions. Collective action is always very powerful. And the best way to describe this is the Zionist lobby. In fact, the gun lobby in America too. The gun lobby is amazing at this. But the Zionist lobby in America figured out very quickly that if every individual Zionist acted in their own way, it was going to be almost completely meaningless to the cause. And that's where you create almost like a unity, an ethos of unity amongst people, which is, we'll debate and we'll argue and we'll go back and forth at each other. But when it comes time to kind of circle the wagons, or when it comes time when our objective is under threat, we're all going to act together. We're all going to donate to the same people. We're all going to vote for the same people. We're all going to go after the same people. We're all going to, we're going to have this unity in action. And what that ends up meaning is that a very small population ends up punching far above their weight, because their unity of action has far more consequence than individual actions that everybody thinks is going to go in one way or the other. As the famous saying goes, one man making a mistake, one man doing the wrong thing is a mistake. 3 men doing the wrong thing together is a strategy. Your strategies don't have to be 100% foolproof perfect. They have to be agreed upon collectively. I hear this from like people who work in like different political things, where they're like, oh, this is my strategy, that's your strategy, you can do your strategy, I'm going to do my strategy. It's like, honey bunches, that's not
anymore.
But that's not even a strategy. That's not even a strategy. That's just you doing your thing and me doing my thing. And I got a plan and you got a plan and we're going to do our plan separately. That's not a strategy. A strategy is only when collectively you move in coordinated ways. And that is what we're really lacking as Muslims. we're lacking hope, we're lacking leadership. We're definitely lacking leadership that feels empowered to be able to create strategies. And we're lacking people actually deciding that, what, I don't agree with this because I don't think it's going to go well. But the only thing that gives us a chance at anything is collective action. And so what, you know what? I'm going to do it anyways because we have to make collective action. And I think when you marry that with the ethos of Khilafah, the ethos of doing things for the love of Allah and not because of me and myself and my this and my whatnot, that becomes a very powerful rallying cry that people can get behind. Let's go and make mistakes. We're going to make mistakes together. Damn, that's a rough one. Yes, okay. My final words of advice to the average listener is, don't be satisfied with being an intellectual Muslim. What I mean by that is, and don't be satisfied with being a Muslim in the personal and very safe and comfy and secure in, I fast, I have a beard, I wear hijab, and that's my Islam. That's not your Islam, right? Your Islam, that is a part of your Islam. But if that's all your Islam was, then that's not enough, right? One of the very powerful hadith Qudsis that we have, and this hadith actually tells us that you're not just going to be asked about what you did, but you're going to be asked about what you didn't do. And that's the hadith where, the man goes to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the day of judgment. And he asks him, I was sick and you didn't visit me, and I was hungry, you didn't feed me. And he says, Ya Allah, how do you get sick and you get hungry? And he says, well, wasn't so and sick and you didn't visit him, wasn't so and so hungry and you didn't feed him. And one of the takeaways from that hadith is, you're not just going to be asked about what you did. You're going to be asked about what you didn't do, that you had the power to do, they had the ability to do. And we are very good as a community in general about praying and fasting and like the kind of little stuff, right? But we're not very good at looking at the opportunities that are around us and the responsibilities that are around us and deciding that, okay, no, I am going to be part of that generation that made the difference. Part of that is having the emotional courage to face disappointment, to face grief, to face hurt, because you'd rather do that than to stop trying. The problem is that disappointment is very painful, extraordinarily painful. And like, how should I put this? We have people who have a difficult time with emotional courage in their relationships, but they want to free the ummah.
Yeah.
How are you going to have the emotional courage to free the ummah when you don't have the emotional courage to go apologize to your husband or wife, right? Like, courage is an ethos. Courage is a way of thinking. It's a worldview. It's not simply something that, that is, you're courageous on the streets and then at home you're not. No, the core of everything is to be able to have emotional courage in every single thing you do in your life. To have emotional courage in trusting people, to have emotional courage in working with people, to have emotional courage in making mistakes, to have the emotional courage to be able to be wrong and to apologize, to have the emotional courage to love. These are all things that require emotional courage and that build the muscle of courage. We need, as a community, as a society, as people, as Muslims, to have the ethos of courage. And that ethos of courage, and to enable courage, right? So somebody comes and says, Mom, I want to start a business. She says, what do you mean you're going to start? If your business fails, everybody's going to laugh at you. That is an ethos of cowardice, not an ethos of courage. The ethos of courage is he goes and says, Mom, I'm going to start a business. And she says, okay, honey, I'm right behind you the whole way through. We have to have an ethos of courage. You look at Muslim society from all the way to the top to all the way to the bottom. And what we are is a deeply anxious and insecure community. And because of our anxiety and insecurity, we pull each other down because we don't have the courage to lift each other up. We need to have a complete revolution in our psyche before we have a revolution in society.
I think that's brilliant. Jazakallah khair for those words. And I'm actually going to tack on 2 more lines that you wrote in your article, The Tolling Bell of Revolution, that I think really sum up everything that we discussed and that we need to remind ourselves of. So you said, this ummah will not be liberated as a hobby to take a break from our 9-to-5 jobs and to enrich our American dreams. It is a social, cultural, economic, political, intellectual, and spiritual project. Our task is the reconstruction of an entire civilization, not remodeling a desk. We have to choose to bet on ourselves, to not simply run the race made for everyone else, but to create the race that we were always made for. And I really love the way that you summarize Iqbalian thought in those 2 lines. And they're practical and they're pragmatic and they're realistic, even though so many of us might think that it's way out of our pay grade or way out of our capacity, but it's really not. So thank you again for spending 2 hours with me and jumping down all the rabbit holes that we wanted to jump down while discussing Islam and decoloniality.
No, thank you so much for having me. We didn't even get to talk about the merits of the composite bow over the long bow, but
Another day, another time, inshallah.
Inshallah.
So take care. And to our listeners, as always, share your thoughts, share your feedback, share your comments. Let us know how you are going to be part of the Islamic thought revolution, the societal revolution, all of it. Jazakumullah khair. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Hey everyone, don't forget to subscribe to our podcast and follow us online on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram on our handle Muslim Matters. And check out our site daily at muslimmatters.org. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you in the next one, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.